So now let's turn our attention to the dermis, which is the deepest and the thickest of the two layers that belong to the skin. The dermis consists of two layers, the superficial papillary layer and the deep reticular layer. Together, the papillary and reticular layers consist of strong but flexible connective tissues. Recall that connective tissues have a few scattered cells, but are primarily composed of extracellular matrix and protein fibers. The dermis, being a connective tissue, is highly well vascularized. The blood vessels that are in the dermis function to nourish the dermis itself, but also nourish the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum that are located in the epidermis. The dermis is also very well innervated with nervous tissues as well as sensory receptors. This image of a section through the dermis shows the rich variety of structures that are housed within it. So we see nervous system tissues, the coiled ducts of sweat glands. We also see blood vessels such as arteries and veins, as well as adipose tissue. The papillary layer of the dermis is the superficial layer of the dermis, and it sits right up against the stratum basale that belongs to the epidermis. It is composed of areolar connective tissue, and we see that there are rich capillary networks found within areolar connective tissue, which function to, in this case, function to nourish the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum of the epidermis, because we see diffusion of nutrients out of those blood vessels that get to those layers of the epidermis. The papillary layer contains small peg-like projections that are very appropriately named dermal papillae. The dermal papillae help to bind the dermis to the epidermis by interlocking the two layers together. Many dermal papillae also contain small capillary loops, which bring those capillaries in close proximity to the epidermis. Others house free nerve endings, which function as either pain or temperature receptors, or they also house touch receptors, which are called tactile corpuscles. Those structures may also be located within the papillary dermis. So the dermal papillae form small ridges, which also gives small ridges to the epidermis, because the epidermis simply follows and is contoured by the shape of the dermis. This creates the small triangles that are seen on the surface of the skin. So in thick skin, such as that found on the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet, the dermal papillae sit on top of larger mounds called dermal ridges, which in turn cause the overlying epidermis to form ridges as well, which are called epidermal ridges. And those epidermal ridges are shown in part C of the diagram shown on this slide on the right here. Collectively, these ridges of the dermis and the epidermis enhance our ability to grip certain kinds of surfaces. They also contribute to our sense of touch by amplifying things like vibrations. The papillary dermis contains an abundance of collagen fibers that are shown in pink in this image here, as well as elastic or elastin fibers, which are shown in purple in this diagram, which gives the dermis the ability to stretch but also remain very tough thanks to the abundant collagen that's there as well. So it is a little bit stretchy and flexible, but it also is very tear resistant as well. So there are a few touch and pressure sensitive structures located in the dermis. The tactile corpuscles are primarily located in the dermal papillae of hairless skin. So for example, the nipples, the external genitalia, the fingertips, the soles of the feet, and also the eyelids. These sense very light pressure as well as vibration. Recall that in the epidermis we saw Merkel cells, which are also called tactile cells, that also sensed touch. So be careful not to confuse the tactile cells, which are in the epidermis, with the tactile corpuscles that we just described here. And those tactile corpuscles are located in the dermis. So these are two different structures that are both sensing very light touches or pressures. In the deeper dermis, there are structures that are called lamellar corpuscles, which function to sense deep pressure, stretch, as well as high-frequency vibration. These corpuscles resemble a roughly kind of a cut onion in cross-section. So both diagrams here show a tactile corpuscle, which, as we mentioned previously, are found in the papillary dermis of primarily skin that is hairless, that is, it does not contain any hairs. The areolar connective tissue of the papillary dermis has a very extensive network of blood vessels. And these blood vessels, capillaries, are referred to as the subpapillary vascular plexus. Because this plexus lies in close proximity to the stratum basale of the epidermis, we see that nutrients and oxygen will diffuse out of these blood vessels to the stratum basale and even up to the stratum spinosum of the epidermis. So these capillary clusters help to nourish those deeper layers of the dermis. Next we have the reticular dermis, and the reticular dermis composes the majority of dermal tissue. It is composed primarily of dense irregular connective tissue, which, as we've seen previously, contains mostly collagen fibers. And these fibers are tough and they resist stretching or tearing, which really helps to enhance the strength of the dermis as a whole. Granted, the name of the reticular dermis is a bit confusing because it's made up of dense irregular connective tissue instead of being composed of reticular connective tissue. The reticular dermis also contains a network of blood vessels referred to as the dermal vascular plexus. So this is a deeper network of blood vessels which function to nourish the deep layers of the dermis. They do have small capillaries that extend up to the subpapillary vascular plexus that we saw in the papillary layer of the dermis, but this is a separate network of blood vessels that has an entirely different function. So melanin is not the only substance that contributes to the color of our skin. The pink or red color of fair skin is primarily due to the red color of the pigment called hemoglobin that's found in our red blood cells. Because fair-skinned people only have small amounts of melanin in their skin, this makes the epidermis nearly transparent and allows the red color of hemoglobin from the dermal blood vessels to show through. So when hemoglobin is poorly oxygenated, the skin may take on a blue or bluish-gray tint, which is referred to as cyanosis. This occurs specifically in the mucous membranes as well as the fingertips or the nail beds. Cyanosis is typically a sign of respiratory or even cardiovascular issues.